Hello and welcome, Not here with my quick meta guide on the Enhancement Shaman for TBC Classic, where things get real interesting thanks to dual wield and a bunch of new talents. Real quick before we begin, I'm making videos like this as I was personally unable to find the information in the format I wanted, so that's how I've broken down these videos. First, we'll cover the PvE basics and what 10 seconds or so in a raid might look like. I'll then cover race choice as briefly as possible, and after that we'll look at the strengths and limitations of the spec in TBC, and finally we'll have some broad overviews of profession and then PvP, but if you wanted super detailed information on these topics you may want to seek specific guides after watching this video of course. So let's get going. As an Enhancement Shaman, your default PvE spec will be a guaranteed 45 points in the enhancement tree. Here we are essentially taking every single good point. We're just avoiding all the relics from the original class design, such as toughness and shield specialization, that are catered towards more creative tastes, I want to say. Then we have two paths we can go for with the remaining 16 points. There is a spec that goes elemental, which may seem like a no-brainer as it has things like concussion to boost our shock damage. However, whilst this may lead to ever so slightly higher individual numbers, and when I say slight I really do mean marginal here, it pales in comparison to what the rest of the tree enables us to do with those spare points, so we're going to focus on that spec. If you checked out the elemental video, you'll know that Resto has a 3% free hit tucked away in it from nature's guidance, and for obvious reasons we are super interested in getting this, just like the Ellie boys. This alone makes up for most of the individual DPS lost from not going into elemental, but on top of this we get a big 25% mana reduction for our totems, and this allows for efficient totem twisting. Yo, what's that? Well, if you're new to totem twisting, you're essentially switching your totems because Wind Fury applies a 9-second buff rather than an aura, so you're able to then immediately put Grace of Air down after Wind Fury, and this will enable you to buff your group with both Wind Fury and Grace of Air at the same time. And essentially this is what all top end shamans have used on private servers, with the only real variation coming from the final 2 points. These 2 points can go into improved reincarnation, which might be helpful on encounters where you expect to be at threat of dying, perhaps progression, or you can put those 2 points into 2% more shock damage in concussion, which is in elemental. It's pretty relevant, but 2% of shocks isn't anything crazy, so pick between those two as you will. Some are happy to get the Ank ability being a bit stronger, but either works. So that's our spec covered. What about the stats? Well, just like elemental, we've got 9% hit from just our spec, and as such hit rating is quite a middling stat. Because our yellow hits are already capped, we're only benefiting our white hits. In this case, again, it's a pretty solid stat, just unspectacular. In contrast to this, however, our other stat related to hitting the boss, expertise, is our number one priority. I had a big explanation here of why expertise is important, but essentially you're trying to get 6.25% dodge reduction, which is about 99 expertise rating, or 79 if you're orc. However, quite simply, it's super hard to get expertise capped, and in many cases of the game, it just won't be correct to expertise cap because of just how hard it is to get good pieces with expertise. Towards the end of the game, you may get close or indeed hit your expertise cap, but essentially it's not a mandatory thing that you have to get like hit is for some other specs. Simply expertise, super high value, get it where you can. After expertise, we are primarily interested in strength, crit, agility, hit haste, attack power, and armor penetration. And it is in that order as far as per point values are concerned. 2 things to note. Haste starts off pretty okay and scales amazingly well up to the end game. It becomes close to 2 attack power per point, which is very strong, and becomes one of our best stats. Second, armor penetration, contrary to other melee specs, is our worst stat per point. Yeah, it's still busted and it rises in value per point over the tiers the more you get of it, but its per point value remains the lowest out of all of our stats. But you may be wondering, yo, this Not guy's making a real big deal out of saying per point values. Yeah, you're right, because the caveat here is that whilst Armor Pen is the least valuable per point, there's typically a lot of it on items compared to say crit or haste or hit. Let's take 2 items at the end game for a very quick example. Embrace of the Phoenix is a leatherworking craft from a Sunwell pattern, and a similar chest in overall value is here from Muru in Sunwell Plateau. We can see that the agility amounts are similar, the strength and AP kind of balance out, they all have 3 sockets, but then we see one that has 44 haste rating and the other has 196 armor pen. As such, the difference is much closer than you think compared to the overall stat value per point. To get to my point here, armor penetration is really good still, but it's just not as crazy as it is for pure physical damage classes like warrior. So ultimately, don't shun armor pen just because it's lowest on this list. You often get a lot of it on your gear towards the end of the game, and that makes up for the fact that it's less value per point because you're getting more of it than you would have haste, hit, crit, etc. We good? Yeah, I think we're good. At least I hope we are. Now's the fun part, right? Enhancement is all about shocks, totems, and keeping Stormstrike on cooldown, of course. Our first priority is to maintain our Flame Shock damage over time effect on the boss or our target. And other than that, we're mashing Stormstrike and Earthshock on cooldown. Though we need to be mindful in the case of Earthshock, because shocks have a global 6-second cooldown, we don't want to delay our Flame Shock too long by a very late Earthshock in regards to our dot timer. Outside of this, we're doing that totem twist business I mentioned earlier. If you are new to this concept, the gameplay is pretty simple. Typically, but not always, you're going to end up storm striking and going immediately into Summon Wind Fury totem, and then immediately summoning a Grace of Air totem to replace your Wind Fury right after that. This generates a 9-second Wind Fury buff to you and your party, whilst keeping up Grace of Air for the majority of the fight also. Also, don't forget to pop Shamanistic Rage, our cooldown, whenever you start dipping low on mana. A final thing is that we are prioritizing Grace of Air last. So if you cannot avoid incurring a delay somewhere down the line in a fight, make sure you're delaying Grace of Air rather than a shock or your Wind Fury totem global, for example. So now we know what we know. What's the best race? Well, for PvE it's really close, and again I had a really long explanation here, but I want to keep things as brief as possible just so you get the information that you need. It's super close. In a vacuum, Orcs would win. Extra expertise from your axes, from using axes rather, and Blood Fury, giving both the attack power and spell damage component compared to pure DPS classes, is fantastic. So we're very interested in Blood Fury, and of course we're getting expertise. But the big problem, and we're going to expand on this a bit later in the profession section, for much of the game you're going to be using 2 Dragon Strikes if you're metagaming. In regards to replacing Dragon Strike, there just aren't too many items that beat it, especially in regards to axes. As such, the times where you're actually going to have this expertise from axe specialization is a very small portion of the game at best. So in this case, Troll is a bit better in my opinion by a small margin. Berserking is very powerful, given that it is a 10 to 30% haste buff, so you're literally going to be meleeing like a rabid addict when you combine this with Bloodlust, Stormstrike, Drums, etc.
Is this a 5 o'clock free crack giveaway?
And I did want to point out that even without the X specialization, Orc's Blood Fury is still pretty damn strong also. It gives us both attack power and spell damage. As mentioned, that's 282 attack power, 143 spell damage, so definitely relevant amounts, for 15 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. So it's very close. It's basically a decision between those 2 cooldowns because you're not going to get too much from the expertise that Orcs get. So for that reason alone, A, it's super close, and B, go with your preference. That appears to be what people are doing on private servers, especially even the metagamers, and I would encourage the same. It's really close, so go with either. Talons don't provide any DPS benefits for PvE, and Draenei do provide 1% spell hit to their group, which is a little bit mediocre because we're typically operating in a melee based group. But hey, at least the Prot Paladin may be gaining a decent threat boost from it, so it's not too bad by any means, it's just not all control. For PvP, it's super close, people will have their preferences I believe, but I suspect that many will lean towards Orcs because they have both Blood Fury and the passive stun resistance, though it is lower at 15% compared to 25% in current Classic. That said, however, Warstomp being an AoE stun is really good in the right situations, and 5% HP isn't awful as a passive. Again, Berserking does have its place here because it's a super strong burst cooldown, and the comp we're going to run in Arena if we're metagaming is going to love Berserking. But more on that later. So, Enhanced Shaman, what's good? Well, first and foremost, Enhance has very strong single target damage in fights where minimal movement occurs. Similar to the Fury Warrior, Kil'jaeden is one of the standout fights for the Enhancement Shaman. It ticks all the boxes for melee specs to do well. It's late in the game, literally the final encounter. There's not much movement, and you just get to Zerg one target, essentially. And in this case, Enhancement just doesn't disappoint. In fact, for much of Sunwell Plateau and Black Temple, Enhancement performs very strongly in single target damage. You're not going to be a chart topper aside from perhaps Kil'jaeden if you're very fortunate with crits. And on top of this, we of course cannot talk about the strengths of the Enhancement Shaman without mentioning the Shaman card. Between Bloodlust and Totem Twisting, Enhancement Shamans are essential as raid buff bots. This paired with the solid scaling and good late game damage on single targets, Enhancement are quite simply the most desired melee spec in TBC. However, going into the limitations here, many players have a preference to play melee or ranged, and the die-hard melee boys will be looking at the Enhancement Shaman as the ideal reroll to avoid being a ranged DPS given how class balance is in PvE. As such, you may have some competition for raid spots that say an Elemental Shaman wouldn't typically have. But that said, if you're choosing melee in TBC, Enhancement is probably the safest pick in regards to getting your raid spot. The final limitation is, of course, and again, this is going to look like a copy and paste from the Fury section, you're a melee spec. Whilst Enhancement doesn't have an awful time in tier 4, like say a rogue does on the meters, it isn't stellar. And in tier 5 and early tier 6 progression, it's not going to be that pretty on damage output, just like other melee specs. You are often one of the better melee specs, though with all that utility as well, you won't realistically have the fear of being benched like a rogue does. It swings and roundabouts people. The very worst case I can see is that you might be the first person to be asked to heal a little bit because they're transitioning from say 5 to 6 healers, and in that case you typically get that resto respec going on one of your enhancers. Ultimately, life's pretty damn good for a shaman, even when we talk about the limitations. This brings us to professions, and you guessed it, leatherworking and our standard round of applause for the Supreme Leader are here. Being a shaman is probably not enough to escape this very strong profession due to drums of course, and to be honest, it does have a nice late game chest craft to keep you happy later on, though not quite BIS, but close enough. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, Enhancement kinda has another locked profession in regards to PvE metagaming goes, and this is that mace I was talking about in the race section. Dragon Strike is just overpowered. In 2.4.3 you can wield 2 of them even. To add to this bonkers weapon proc, there is this graph. And before somebody screams, "Ah, what am I looking at not?" This is basically some highbrow math simulations on weapon speed. It essentially says 2 weapons at 2.6 speed means less Windfury procs being eaten with an offhand attack as opposed to our main hand. So getting more main hand Windfury procs, so that's more damage, compared to different speed combinations that are a little bit faster perhaps. Basically, 2 of this mace is perfect for a huge amount of time in this game. and due to this, blacksmithing is arguably a mandatory profession until you get your hands on something like Hand of the Deceiver from Kil'jaeden. But not. What if I duke leatherworking like a pro and get an even better weapon than Dragon Strike? Well, in that case you're looking at the standard enchanting and jewel crafting picks again. Better gems and Biscayne neck from jewel crafting is probably the play when we replace blacksmithing right at the end of the game, but enchanting also gives us a solid 8 stats, which is worth around 33 attack power or so, which would probably be the best pick rather if you've ditched both leatherworking and blacksmithing. For real though, go leatherworking and blacksmithing and then change blacksmithing to jewel crafting at the end of the game. You'll be really glad you did. And with that sauce, we have got to the PvP section and our new buzzword for the next couple minutes.
It's turbo time!
If you're seeking to push rating exclusively as an enhancement shaman, you're going to go turbo in both 2s and 3s. Zug Zug with a warrior buddy in 2s, and then grab that warrior buddy and a healer, but probably a resto druid, in 3s. If you're not familiar with what turbo is interested in doing, the short version is that they're going to delete the other team under Bloodlust. Whilst there are nuances like setting up a good burst window with a cross CC or interrupt, the gameplay is quite forgiving in a broad sense, and is actually a pretty good comp also for getting your feet wet if you're typically not that kind of guy insofar as going into arena. That said though, it's one of the best comps, especially in regards to just farming the mid to high-ish rating teams needed to propel you to the PvP main hand rating. So for pushing Glad, it's also a great comp, but just not quite the same tier as RMP or Warrior Lock Druid would be at the top percentile of arena players, but in terms of just farming out your main hand, it's a really strong comp, especially for that reason. But not. Is turbo the only way? Maybe not, but it's definitely the way to go, to be honest. Based on all the data and what we've seen in retail as well, turbo is just fairly simple and very effective. Bloodlust, very strong. This brings us to the end of the video. A big appreciation to those that are getting involved in the comments and subscribing. Is great to see and genuinely adds to my day. So, with that said, I will see you next time, hopefully in your notifications.